this video, we are going to be talking about Black horror, specifically queerness in Black horror. The story that we're going to be analyzing today is called The Gilda Stories, written by Joelle Gomez. It is considered to be the first modern depiction of a Black female vampire in literature.
Part 1. The representation of Black people in horror, and why is Black horror terrifying?
According to Tananarive Due, professor at UCLA and the writer of The Sunken Place, Racism, Survival, and the Aesthetic of the Black Horror, she explains that Black people being in it with no racial context is still revolutionary to this day. Due further goes on to explain that protagonists that are Black in horror is significant because of the lack of representation that Black people have in media and especially horror up until recently. But what makes Black horror so scary, and how does it differ from mainstream horror? Due says that Black history is Black horror. She is drawing a line from movies like J.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation to human atrocities such as the Tuskegee Experiment to Atlanta's Art House to the social thriller of Get Out, where Black people as objects of interest are experimented on in a Frankenstein-like manner, explains Jason Farham, a senior writer at Wired, writing on the intersections of race and pop culture. In my opinion, what makes Black horror so scary is the combination of the Black experiments with traditional horror elements. I think that what makes Black horror more scary than mainstream horror is the fact that I cannot change my race, and the point of conflict in most Black horror movies is race. In mainstream horror, I feel like I could rationalize my way outside of the situations that people are getting into. But with Black horror, that's not possible because I cannot change my race. Speaking of identities, what happens when you add womanhood, queerness into the mix of Black horror? Part 2. A brief summary of the Gilda Stories. In the Gilda Stories, it follows the adventures of a Black immortal vampire over 8 chapters. In the 8 chapters, it takes place in different locations and time periods across the U.S. Spanning 200 years from 1850 to 2050, the story follows African American history through slavery, abolition, segregation, the Black Power movement, to a future dystopic world where economic ruin and environmental disaster is prevalent. Gilda is born in a Mississippi plantation, and her mother is from West Africa, who was brought over on a slave ship in the Middle Passage. She escapes her plantation and is in New Orleans, where she meets her first Black woman vampire, who owns a brothel and brings her in and takes her under her wing.
She grows up there in a supportive community of women.
Just before the Civil War begins, the person that brought Gilda in turns Gilda into a vampire, then shortly thereafter kills herself. The name Gilda means gold, and it points to her worth.
Gilda favors men's or gender-neutral clothing throughout her life. These garments show her literally clothed in freedom at every opportunity and suggests her comfort with her lesbian sexuality.
Throughout the book, Gilda has professions where Black women were able to achieve financial independence. Even though Gilda was never a prostitute, she did serve the community more than one occasion, and it is always talked about in an empowering manner.
Part 3. Who is the author? What were the circumstances that led them to write about Gilda? The person that wrote the double Lamba Award-winning novel, The Gilda Stories, is Joelle Gomez, a mixed-race lesbian and a feminist, who, at 15, was fascinated by Dracula, relating to the loneliness she felt as a child of divorced parents and Dracula's doomed pursuit of a companion who will live with him forever. What inspired Gilda to write The Gilda Stories was written as an angry response to being harassed on the street by a couple of guys. Instead of scurrying away, I screamed so hard they ran. They thought I was a mad woman, and I was. That led me to think about a character that people think is powerless and how she can turn the tables on them. Kind of a revenge story at first, but it developed into something more than that. In order to write Gilda, Gomez had to recontextualize the mainstream ethos of the vampire Dracula. To claim vampires as her own and to create a new mythology of vampirism that would work for her audience, Gilda had to embody as well as interrogate the activism that emerged among African Americans, feminists, and lesbians during the highly active political period of the 1970s and the 80s.